I'm recording all this stuff as well, so again, for those of you who miss it, those of you who don't want to listen, or if you need a sleeping aid, you know where to go. Okay, chapter 6. Chapter 6, 7, well, chapter 6 is all about socialism and the development of that. Chapter 7, 8, 9, 10 looks more into more practical stuff. Okay? We'll close these blinds. Can you see? Is this a bit better for you? Okay. Chapter issue here is to what extent are socialism and Marxism responses to classical liberalism? So we were already looking at modern liberalism as well. We're going to look at the contrast. I got to change your attendance.
It's already changed. We went to the office.
Okay, perfect. Well, what are you doing, man? Why are you turning that off? No, open that back up.
It's more better. No, okay.
What are we, vampires going to sit in the dark?
No,
what are the origins of socialist thought and I didn't hear what was said. Maybe that's for the better. This is all on camera, kids, by the way. What have been some democratic socialist responses to classical law? Okay, this is all mumbo jumbo. Okay, we'll just get into the details. Okay, as mentioned, a lot of more modern liberal and socialist thoughts, you can just leave your test on the desk there. They essentially arise from the main question, how do you respond to inequality? Okay, and it's good to understand, well, what is inequality? What causes it? Are all of the causes of inequality something that the government can reduce, eliminate, or zero out? So for example, public education is an attempt at zeroing out the issue of inequality. You know, people come from all sorts of different backgrounds. Some are more wealthier than others. In America, if you're more wealthy, you can pay for a very nice private education. In Canada, it's a little bit more complicated to get a private education, if not impossible. Okay. Additionally, healthcare can be privatized in America. It's very complicated to do that here. It's complicated to get access to private services as well. And it doesn't have to be something extreme as like, well, I want to jump in line for surgery. It could also be, you know, something for myself I'm always interested in getting done is blood work. But right now, to get blood work done, you basically have to get a form from a doctor, request certain things. You can't just go to a lab and say, hey, I want to test my electrolyte levels, just see where I'm at. Or, you know, for men or women, testosterone, estrogen levels, hormone levels, just to see where you're at. It can be very complicated. But the goal of, you know, public healthcare and education is to make things more equal for people, give an opportunity for a baseline education. Now, someone who's more classical, liberal oriented would prefer less intervention and more opportunities. Where does she go? Does she not hand in her test?
No, she didn't. I just gave her a pencil.
10 minutes into her test, she got a pencil. Okay. Again, to deal with the issue of equality and access, again, classical liberals would prefer to have more opportunity and less intervention from the government. Okay, so right now in Alberta and Canada, you know, there's this fight for public education. I'm more on the side of parental choice. You know, obviously, I'm not a parent. I'd like to be, but I would assume that more choice is better. Okay, sorry, my one child's right there. My little one's right there. And many people will argue, well, then that makes it unfair. And again, when you consider equality and where it comes from, you know, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to achieve equality amongst a group of people. And then there's two other main aspects to look at: equality of outcome, and then equality of, like, prior to that, income, not to be mistaken with money. How much you put in, people can vary on that. So some people are willing to work 60, 70, 80 hours a week. Some people are willing to go work in some remote camp off-site, 6 weeks, come back home for 2 weeks. Some people don't want to work more than 20 hours a week. Some people produce work that is very valuable. Some people produce work that can be repeated by just about anyone. Maybe like a monkey if you trained it for 6 months. How do you deal with people's different input and effort versus what they should get out of it. Okay. Proposed changes that are desired as equal opportunities for all, a fair distribution of wealth, focus on cooperation and the group. And in terms of socialism, how it's practically applied to life, it's not clear to me that there's always this desire for equal opportunity for all. Especially some things get really shifty nowadays, which maybe I won't chat about on camera. Generally speaking, in socialism, the resources, the desire is that they should be controlled by the public. And again, it's not obvious to me, what does that even look like? Now, if you're dealing with a free market economy, to some extent, resources are controlled by the public. Where you spend your dollars is your vote. Out of curiosity, you can just raise your hands up or down. How many of you buy organic food at all? Sometimes. Right, I try to buy my eggs in a more organic way. Organic meat can be very expensive. The more dollars you spend on local farmers, organic meat, the more votes you give that market. And so you get to have some control over your resources based on where you spend your money. You gain money in a more capitalist economy by exchanging your labor, your time. Right now you're exchanging your time for an education, if that's what we want to call it. After you graduate, you may exchange your time for further education, training. You may exchange your time for money through a job. So it's not clear to me exactly how these things get controlled by the public. When we get into chapter 7, 8, and 9, we'll look at communist countries and how they brutally controlled things. Cooperation is favored over competition. And at some point I'll go over Unit 1 again with this group. I have better materials made now that are more clear. Some of you might not be clear on all this stuff. Here's a wonderful little chart, if you were ever wondering. So with that assignment, the essay we did, some of you, in terms of collectivism, some of you chose concepts and options that were incorrect, and you suffered. Okay? So if you look at the left side column, that is what this chapter focuses on. Okay? The values of socialism or a collectivist society. You have mainly collective interest, collective responsibility, economic equality, public property, cooperation, and adherence to collective norms. There's a brief explanation there for these. Okay. In terms of economic equality, there's a variety of meanings behind that. It's not, and I'll address what I had mentioned earlier. Economic equality doesn't just mean you get paid the same. So I was wrong on that. I previously taught you incorrectly. That is one option in more extreme socialist, left-wing, collectivist societies, particularly communism. In communism, you get more or less equal outcome. The philosophy behind it is you get what you need. Right? And the question I would pose to that is, well, what determines what you need? If you look at it from a basic mathematical point of view, obviously a family of 4 needs more resources than a family of 1. Okay, but let's say you live a very active lifestyle, you have very demanding work, you probably need more calories, nutrients, rest, and recovery than people who work a job that's not nearly as much. Say that again?
What page is that?
This would be textbook page 147. Okay. Fortunately, it's also in the slides that are on Google Classroom. Okay. Economic equality also means what I was saying earlier, to some extent equal access to resources, to services like healthcare. Like, has anyone here broken a limb, broken a bone?
I had scoliosis surgery last year.
You had a surgery, right? How much did your family pay for that surgery?
I don't know, but it would look free, I guess.
Yeah, it's just paid equally by taxes, right? So all of the people of Canada pay into taxes for healthcare. So you were able to have that surgery, which you said scoliosis?
Yeah. Which
is for the spine. It's a corrective surgery. I had a corrective surgery on my nose. I didn't have to pay a penny for that. Not directly, right? How many of you paid tuition fees to register for school? None, right? You have other fees, right? Like you have if you're in a phys ed related class, you need to pay for field trips because that's a different service. But again, equal access to a decent education and a decent amount of healthcare is also part of economic equality. These spectrums, these charts are also good to understand. I'll have a bunch more of these images in my new notes. I'll upload those at some point so you can check those out as well. We are looking over at this left side. We're looking at more of this democratic socialism, Marxism, communism, although I would say those are essentially the same thing. That's what we're examining in this next chapter. Okay, we already looked at the stuff on the right or on the left side. Okay. Three main people we're going to look at: Robert Owen, Charles Fourier, and Karl Marx. Okay, we're going to start with Robert Owen. So I believe this guy was British or Scottish. Anyways, he owns a textile mill, right? So he's making like fabric material. I believe that's what textiles refers to. I should actually update my reference on that. But like a good capitalist, like an educated capitalist, he felt that it was the responsibility and obligation of the owner to operate a profitable and productive workplace while also treating their workers well. Raise your hand. How many of you feel like you get treated well at work? How many of you, raise your hand, feel like you don't get treated well? I'm not going to vote on this one for legal reasons. But I think I get treated decently.
Yeah.
Are you contributing to the me not getting treated well right now?
No. You're normally treated well, all right? I mean, sir, when was the last time?
Thank you.
When was the last time you were like berated by a parent?
Never. I'm very diplomatic.
By a student?
By a student? We won't discuss that on camera.
Yeah. Or internet.
Some of you feel like you get treated poorly by your place of employment. And whose responsibility is it to solve that problem? You. Why me? I don't work with you. It's your job. You work there. You condone that treatment by staying. I'm what the streets would call a victim blamer. It's a Dave Chappelle reference, okay? For the record. So, Robert Owen, he believes that it is the owner's job to make sure that the employees are treated well and fairly. And that can be done through a variety of means. One is, like some of you might work for a boss that's a complete scumbag. They just treat you like less than human, right? And that's a challenging one, because how do you educate that person to treat people well? Okay, but some of you might just have a boss that doesn't actually know how to do their job. They don't know how to set up a schedule. They don't know how to manage more than themselves. They don't know how to coordinate people's various needs for scheduling and desires. And some of that's going to be very tough, right? Like, it's hard to meet everyone's needs, but part of it is on you. So you can tell your boss, hey, I want more hours, or you can really insist. Keep bringing it up to them. Maybe they'll get irritated, maybe they'll get fired, but it's a risk. If you weren't getting hours anyways, then it's not going to be that big of a loss. Historically, though, they were worried about things like improving living conditions, providing education for children and adults, establishing a market, someplace they could actually buy and sell things, utilize their money where they were selling quality items and food, basic health care, reasonable prices. And this last point relates to how do you actually solve problems. I've had this chat with various teachers as well. Your feedback and advice, given that you can actually be constructive and articulate yourselves well, is one of the best methods for improving how the classroom functions and how enjoyable it might be. But maybe by the ripe age of grade 12, you've been ignored for so long that you don't want to partake. Okay, but that democratic process, when offered, it's a real privilege. I mean, how many of you have ever had an opportunity in your previous years to dictate and determine what actually happens in a classroom? Like in a legitimate way. Like, hey, we proposed an idea to the teacher for a project, and next week we started doing that project. And we worked together to make it better. I don't typically do that with my 12s, but I've done that with a group of 10s and 11s that I've had. And once you've established that relationship with the students, it actually works very well. And you can get to the core of what the problems are, what the misunderstandings are. But this democratic process requires a lot of responsibility on both parts. Not just myself, but the students as well in this scenario, because we're in a classroom. And not everyone has the same capacity to point out what the problem is, and more people are capable of complaining and pointing out problems than they are of providing functional solutions. Some of the adjustments that Robert Owen made was he restricted working hours, so people couldn't just work for like 16 hours a day because that's not good for your health. He raised wages, refused to hire children under the age of 10 because maybe they should be focusing on things like getting educated and growing up. And if you raise wages enough for the parents, make them competitive, marketable, then the family doesn't need that 5, 6, 7-year-old to work. And his company at the time, for a variety of reasons, managed to continue making a profit. And so Robert Owen is trying to find this balance between capitalism, making money, and socialism, being concerned about the welfare and well-being of other people, right? These are two both necessary things that you must do in a society. Because it comes back to the foundational point of, is it better to have money or not have money? Like if you had to choose one or the other, having money or not having money, which one would you pick? That choice would be very simple for people who are not living under a rock. And so you as a business owner, you absolutely must be concerned with how much money you're making, because that's what keeps your employees employed. But that doesn't mean that you need to make 90%, like 90% of the profit needs to go into your pocket.
Hey, why not? That's a good thing.
Okay, I'm gonna pause the video, we'll watch this. Okay, so continuing with Charles Fourier. So he's French socialist. He believes this idea of utopia, okay, a perfect place. A lot of people who are left-wing socialists, they are like many of the more classical ones, they were attempting to create utopia, more or less heaven on earth. Now, many of them managed, as we'll learn in chapters 7, 8, and 9, many of them managed to create hell on earth for many millions of people.
Yeah, Marcos, though. Jesus.
Okay, anyways, he believed it was possible for people in these utopias to prosper and develop to their greatest potential. Now, keep in mind, he wants these people to be organized in small communities. So once I remake PowerPoints, please don't move it. Definitely don't move it. Okay, don't do that.
I don't want it to shake too much.
I love how as soon as I tell you not to move it, you're just like...
Well, like, I wasn't gonna do anything crazy with it.
It's very easy in a small group of people to hold one another responsible and accountable. Right, so for example, for those of you who are on the basketball team, you probably had a pretty good idea of how many points you scored, probably had a pretty good idea of who scored a lot of points, and you probably had a good idea of who did poorly every game. Right, so those three things are easy to keep track of on a team of 15 people. Now, if you had a team of 150 people, it's likely you'll start to notice after a few months who some of the best people are. Right? So some of you had mentioned like, hey, this Quadrant, you know this guy, he plays on this team. Now sure, in Leduc it's easy, right? If all the games were recorded and you could watch them all, you'd figure out who the best people are. how do you do that with 1,500 or 15,000 people? Like, is it possible for you to know 1,500 people? You seem very confident. Okay, start listing them off. Who do you know?
Right now?
Okay, can you know 1,500 people on a personal, intimate level and see them, once a week, twice a week? No, it's impossible. Many human tribal groups and ancient groups, their particular tribe didn't grow bigger than 150 people. They may have had extended tribes, and so part of the challenge with socialism, with collectivism, is that historically it worked really well, like in tribal settings. It also works really well in family settings. But historically it works best in settings where you can keep track of people. Right, so like I have a pretty good idea right now who's just screwing around on their phone and who's napping. It's very easy to see.
Yeah, there's the case.
Right? But if we went into, like if we did mass, first of all, 100 people are just not going to be there. And of the 215 people who are there, keeping track of every single individual is hard. You might be able to keep track of your area. But the bigger numbers you get, it's harder to keep track of people. And that's very important to understand. One of the criticisms of, in practical sense, of socialist, left-wing, collectivist ideologies. Like, how do you actually keep track of people? How do you get them to do things that they don't want to do? In communist China, they use weapons, guns, military, starvation. That's we'll learn about the Holodomor, which is a organized starvation of Ukrainian people by Stalin in the communist Russia. It's about 10 to 12 million people starved to death. Okay, we'll look more about that. So, when you have large cities, 10,000 to 10 million people, it's very hard to organize everyone. And who should organize? Like one person organizing 10 million people is going to be very challenging. These utopias would require careful planning and regulation. It's very challenging to plan for every single potential outcome. Again, coming to the example of basketball, it's pretty reasonable. You can have a pretty reasonable expectation of what you'll face on defense, what they might try on offense. And so it's easy to manage that, but with human life, there's a lot of variation. And it's hard to organize these things. So Karl Marx, who developed, he wrote the Communist Manifesto, was behind the communist theory, along with Frederick Engels. He essentially creates an ideology, a system of class warfare and struggle. Washroom?
Yeah.
This idea that you have some sort of enemy that is of a similar, maybe semi-related group. Okay, so for example, practically speaking, it might be people, like men and women, are at odds with one another, and they're always vying for power. Rich people and poor people, smart and dumb, let's say, okay, black and white, right? These are, there's always these categories of people who are oppressed and oppressors. But in his philosophy and his ideology, it is very black and white. So people might literally interpret it as that, as black people and white people. And in America, they're pushing that ideology that, black people are oppressed by a variety of means, by white people. And so that creates a conflict in society. Well, people don't like living in a state of conflict, and people would like solutions to conflicts. Well, Karl Marx's solution was violent revolution. So if you're, let's say, a black American, then you should overthrow some of the government and legal structures. So the whole abolish police movement is very similar and related to that. That the police are used as a mechanism to oppress citizens, and they oppress minority citizens or people of color more than they do white people. And therefore we should look to overthrow and dismantle that system. And they tried it in a couple areas. Anyone want to guess at what happened after they got rid of the police? Crime went through the roof. Sexual crimes as well. All sorts of crimes. Because you're looking at me.
There's just a pause there. I was like, not react.
And so for Karl Marx, the struggle between classes is the most important force in society. And we should live in a classless society, you know, and practically speaking, it's not obvious what that even means. Maybe one day I'll muster up the willpower to read the Communist Manifesto, but that day is not today.
Did you say like police? There was no police at one point?
In some places in America. So do you know about? Okay, why is there water on the floor there? What's going on? Buddy, your bottle's leaking.
Oh shit.
It's pre-workout. It's pre-workout, guys. Pre-workout eating.
So, do you know about Chaz, or Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone?
No.
In one of the cities on the west coast of America, let me just look at the map quickly. But Chaz was basically, you know, when all those BLM riots were happening,
Fuck yeah.
right?
They're everywhere.
I think it was in either Oregon or Washington. I think it was Portland. It was in Portland, Chaz.
What?
So, while the BLM riots and protests were happening,
It's in
they-
Seattle, I believe.
Fuck yeah.
Portland, right? Portland's the city where this happened. And so essentially what happened was they rioted, they burned down the police station,
Yeah.
and then they created Chaz, Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, where they themselves guarded and protected with guns, the ones they use in the military,
Jesus.
to make sure police couldn't come in and out. And the mayor supported them. The chief of police was trying to go in there with a bunch of people and say, hey, we want to make sure people are safe. Now, obviously, those people with guns were like, no, you're not coming in here because we don't believe in the police. Abolish the police. And so they left this place alone. And the media didn't bother covering any of this. This went quietly under the bridge, water under the bridge. But I listened to some podcasts where they were talking about, well, rapes went up. Use of drugs
Murder.
went up. Probably people murdered, which, you know, that went on for 5-6 weeks, right? So like if you kill somebody and 6 weeks later it doesn't get reported, and that body's taken care of. Like it's gone. Like after 6 weeks, they're probably not even gonna search, because how do you find it?
Yeah.
The trail's gone cold, right? So rapes went up, sexual violence, crimes, theft, robberies, all that stuff, it all went up.
How long does this last for?
I think Chaz was about 6 weeks, maybe 3 months at longest, but that would be really
crazy.
pushing. I think it was 6 weeks. But you gotta understand, after, you know, maybe 2 months, people were begging the police to come back in. And what relationship do you think that establishes with the police there now? Like, do you think people want to volunteer to go police in an area where they don't want to be?
Hell no.
Hell no, right? Like, do you want to sit at a table with a bunch of people that don't like you? Probably not. Well, maybe you would, because
Yeah,
you're
unless
you,
you're pressing
right?
and this shit, and yeah, it'd be funny.
So,
Yeah.
you know, this idea here that you must seize power and take control, a lot of people might have to die for you to achieve that. And, you know, in Karl Marx's philosophy, that's okay. And although they, well, actually, we'll just say that when we start talking about Russia later on. In doing this, they would achieve freedom from class-based societies, although it's not obvious that that wouldn't just occur shortly after, which is exactly what happened in Russia. It's just that instead of having class based on, well, let's say you were really good at farming and you made a lot of money from farming, and so naturally you gained resources and wealth, so you're, let's say, upper class. Instead, it's people who are in Stalin and Lenin and whoever's inner circle, right? They're the ones who actually get to make decisions and influence things. Until Stalin went crazy and started killing them all. All would share in the production of goods and wealth. We put that in quotations, until the communist regime thought that you were holding out on goods and they choose to starve you. Or if you went over to China and experienced communism there, until they decided that, hey, one of our steel manufacturing industries is not doing so well. Well, what we'll do is we'll take all of the metal from our citizens and take it from them, because, you know, private property ain't a thing. And how dare you keep your metal pots and pans to cook food in when we're trying to build utopia? Question.
In your own words, how would you describe Karl Marx?
Well, I never knew the guy. But what I will say is that despite the fact that he wrote that, you know, all of this stuff, do you know where he got the money to write his books?
From the... Does he work?
He did not work. He was too good for that.
So he's...
His friend didn't work either. His friend's dad had a few companies, and the money from that supported his books. So you'll learn about that in the video we'll watch tomorrow. Okay, I think, yeah, this is the last slide we'll do today. Anyways, according to Marx, socialist society should include a shift of private property to public. Shift here is used very generously. In practicality, it looks a lot like theft. Like, hey, you don't need your farm. You don't need your family car. It's our car, brother. It's the community's car. Would be really great for basketball. Hey, instead of taking a bus, we just take a couple vehicles. We just start stuffing kids in there. Okay. Creating new factories that are controlled and owned by the government, or everyone, however that looks like. Because there aren't really any good practical examples of this being done, probably because it's difficult, if not impossible. Centralized banks controlled by the government, so we already have those. Government control of transportation and communication, that's already happening. Communication, although, is a little tricky with social media and whatnot, but you know, people will comment on a lot, and if you're paying attention to this, there's a lot of collusion between social media companies and governments, right? Like there's a lot of stuff coming out now from the the government elections in America and the censorship that goes on from big social media companies online. Right, so this stuff is already going on. Free education for children in public schools, that's already happening. You know, the Nazis and the communists figured it out pretty quickly, and I was just talking about residential schools in my grade 9s. It's very easy to change the way a society goes if you capture its youth and educate them in the ways that you want. You know, so it's always good to ask yourself, well, why are we learning about, you know, X, Y, Z, and specifically, particularly when it comes to social studies? You know, there's so much to be learned about Canada's history, but we focus on the worst aspects of it. And it's always done through a narrative where, you know, Canadians or Canadian culture is seen as a bad thing. But for many people around the world, Canadian culture is a saving grace. You know, it was for my family. When my family left Pakistan, it was because our specific religious community was considered non-Muslim in that country, and there was no legal action taken when people murdered members of my community. I think in 2008, there was an attack on a mosque where about 50 to 60 people were gunned down while praying, while worshiping. So when my family came here in 1998, you know, Canadian culture with its tolerance and acceptance of differences, not always perfect, because, you know, things weren't so great after 9/11, but that's understandable. There's a lot of hurt feelings, a very scary time in history, but generally, you know, the culture has been very accepting and the people are very accepting. And so it's always good to ask, when you see a point like that, you know, why are we learning what we're learning? And what does it achieve?